A single clue brought Miss Marple face to face with a killer. Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon. If you love mysteries, tap like and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from, your comments always make my day. Let's begin. St. Aldwyn-on-Field was the sort of English village that prided itself on two things, its venerable sense of propriety and its roses, neither of which tended to appreciate disruptions. On this particular mild June afternoon, both were on full and glorious display at the annual Garden Society tea, held on the wide lawns behind Hawthorne Lodge, home of the redoubtable Mrs. Clarissa Pencaro. It was an event so accustomed to perfect politeness that even the bees buzzing over the lemon cake seemed to do so with decorum. Ladies in pastel frocks mingled among immaculately trimmed hedges, their voices rising and falling like the soft cooing of doves. Gentlemen, mostly retired colonels, bank managers, and one or two antiquarians, stood about discussing the weather with the seriousness of diplomats negotiating a treaty. And within this comfortable tapestry of English respectability sat Miss Jane Marple. She had accepted Mrs. Pencaro's invitation with her customary graciousness, though she suspected the woman's motives had less to do with affection and more to do with pride. After all, it lent a certain cachet to have a guest of Miss Marple's reputation seated by the hydrangeas. Nothing quite enlivened a garden tea like the presence of a lady quietly rumored to have solved, with alarming frequency, those dreadful murders that oughtn't occur in polite society, but invariably did. Miss Marple, in her pale blue dress and sensible hat, looked very much like a forgettable old lady who might ask one to pass the sugar. Which was precisely how she preferred it. She sat quietly now, hands folded, observing the drift of villagers around her with mild, unassuming interest. Mrs. Bantry was loudly praising Mrs. Pencaro's begonias. Mr. Rupert Densham, a solicitor of cautious manners, was chatting to the new vicar, and young Lily Archer, who served as Mrs. Pencaro's companion, fluttered about the tea tables in a state of nervous attentiveness. But the real center of attention, though he pretended not to notice, was Mr. Lionel Bexley. Tall, silver at the temples, and possessed of an air of perpetual self-satisfaction, Mr. Bexley had only recently come to St. Aldwyn to take possession of Fielding Manor, a handsome property that had sat empty for years. He had introduced himself to the village with a confidence that implied the village ought to be grateful for the honor. And though he insisted he was a gentleman of leisure, certain facts whispered through the hedgerows. He had been seen arguing with a tradesman, he carried expensive luggage for a man of modest declared means, and he had received, only yesterday, a letter at the post office that left him pale and tight-lipped. Miss Marple noticed these things. She noticed everything. But she said nothing, not even when Mr. Bexley approached her now with that curious mix of charm and calculation that suggested he was taking the measure of her. "Miss Marple," he said pleasantly, "how delightful to see you again. I was just remarking to Mrs. Pencaro how comforting it is to join a community where everyone knows one another. One feels safe." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bexley," she replied gently, "one mustn't be too confident about that. Some of the most dreadful things I've witnessed occurred in villages far quieter than Street Aldwyn." His smile faltered, just slightly. "Indeed?" But before Miss Marple could answer, a sudden commotion arose near the long tea table. A plate clattered to the grass. Someone cried out. Then came a sharp, strangled sound, from Lily Archer. The young woman stood frozen, her face drained of color as she stared at something just beyond the rose trellis. Miss Marple rose at once. The villagers followed Lily's gaze. There, half concealed among the fragrant blossoms, lay a man's shoe. Attached to it, horribly, unmistakably, was the man. Gasps spread like ripples over a pond. Mrs. Pencaro shrieked. Mr. Densham muttered something about fainting. The vicar crossed himself with unsteady fingers. Miss Marple stepped forward, though she did not push into the throng. She remained where she could observe without distracting from the shock overtaking the others. The victim was a man of middle age, neatly dressed, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the pallor of death that lay upon it. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky through a tangle of crimson-dappled roses. There was no question about the cause. Even from several paces away, Miss Marple could see the wound, a deep, purposeful gash just below the left ear. Not an accident. Not a fall. Something far more deliberate. "Good heavens," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "It's Mr. Pencaro's cousin, isn't it? Harold Pencaro." A murmur of recognition rippled through the onlookers. Harold Pencaro. Returned only last week after 20 years abroad. Mysterious circumstances. Rumors of debts, bad company, and a quarrel with his cousin over some inheritance matter. Miss Marple's mind flicked, very gently, through these bits of gossip, no more than village embroidery on the edges of truth. But gossip, she often said, was merely human nature without the varnish. Mr. Bexley, who had been standing behind her, suddenly muttered, "Good Lord." His face was slightly too pale. His eyes moved quickly, far too quickly, for a man seeing a corpse for the first time. Miss Marple tucked that detail away. Mrs. Pencaro, nearly hysterical now, clutched at Lily Archer for support. "Oh, my poor cousin. Dead, in my garden. What will the papers say? My begonias, ruined." But Lily's distress was different. Not social embarrassment, but something deeper, sharper. Guilt? Fear? Recognition? Miss Marple tilted her head. "Lily, dear," she said softly, "had you seen Mr. Pencaro earlier today?" Lily jerked as though struck. "No. No, Miss Marple. I mean, yes, he passed through the garden an hour ago. But I didn't speak to him. I never spoke to him." Miss Marple nodded as if Lily's flustered contradiction were perfectly natural. The police were summoned. Inspector Graves arrived, a stout, brisk man with a habit of asserting authority by speaking louder than necessary. Within minutes he had cordoned off the trellis with a rope borrowed from Mrs. Pencaro's gardener. "A clear case of foul play," he declared. "And the murderer can't be far. Likely a vagrant, or a thief. Crimes like this don't spring from respectable citizens." Miss Marple's lips pressed together, though politely. She had known many respectable citizens who committed murder, usually for reasons that were embarrassingly human. Her gaze drifted among the gathered villagers. Mr. Lionel Bexley, calculating. Lily Archer, trembling. Mrs. Pencaro, overwrought. Harold Pencaro, dead. And somewhere, hiding in plain sight, someone who had walked into a garden party with murder on their mind. As the murmurs swelled and the inspector barked orders, a faint breeze stirred the roses, carrying with it the scent of summer. Miss Marple, unnoticed amidst the confusion, breathed it in. "A strange thing," she murmured to herself, "how death can slip so quietly into a peaceful garden." And though no one heard her, she added a final thought, "It rarely does so without leaving at least one unmistakable clue." The shock of the discovery lingered long after Inspector Graves had declared the garden off-limits. Groups formed and dissolved in anxious clusters, each person eager to recount their version of events, to insist they had seen something or someone suspicious, if only they could remember precisely who. The once celebratory murmur of the afternoon had transformed into a frantic buzz, sharp and uneven, like wasps disturbed from their hive. Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided gently to a garden bench by Colonel Weatherford's wife, who was convinced the elderly lady must be in need of a restorative sit-down. In truth, Miss Marple felt quite steady. Years of observing human tragedy had given her a calm that unsettled even those who admired her. She thanked Mrs. Weatherford, then settled in to listen. On the lawn nearby, Mrs. Bantry was whispering theatrically to Mrs. Densham. "Well, Clarissa's cousin or not, one doesn't simply turn up dead in a rose bed without some very unpleasant business behind it. You heard about Harold, didn't you? The scandal in Cairo? Something to do with forged letters or misappropriated funds, I forget which, but dreadful all the same." Mrs. Densham shushed her, glancing left and right to ensure no one overheard. "My dear, you mustn't repeat such things until the inspector has asked questions. It's quite improper." "Improper?" Mrs. Bantry scoffed softly. "My husband always said that staying silent is precisely how wickedness thrives. Besides, everyone knows Harold Pencaro never returned home without dragging trouble behind him." Miss Marple tucked away those comments. She found that even the most exaggerated gossip often contained a grain of truth, though it tended to be hidden beneath layers of embellishment. A few yards away, Lily Archer stood at the edge of the lawn, cradling a tray she had forgotten to set down. Her fingers trembled against the silver, her face drawn and pale. Miss Marple noted how she kept glancing toward the gate at the far end of the garden, an unconscious movement, but telling. People often look not at what frightens them, but at what they hope might free them from the fear. Someone, or something, was beyond that gate in Lily's mind, whether or not it actually stood there. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had stationed himself in the center of the lawn like a general preparing for battle. "No one is to leave," he announced, raising his voice to command immediate compliance. "We'll begin taking statements at once. One at a time, if you please. The constable will see to you." His certainty, Miss Marple thought, was frequently his greatest impediment. Mr. Lionel Bexley stepped toward the inspector, smoothing his coat with a practiced gesture. "Inspector," he said courteously, "it might be helpful if I begin, given that my property borders Mrs. Pencaro's." If some intruder made his way through the gardens, Inspector Graves eyed him with a mixture of respect and suspicion, the former for his confident manner, the latter because confident men often irritated him. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Bexley. For now, please remain with the others." Bexley's mouth tightened, just perceptibly, before he returned to the group. Miss Marple observed how he avoided meeting anyone's gaze for long, as though weighing the risks of each glance. Clarissa Pencaro herself had been led inside by her maid, overcome by a sudden attack of nerves. Or perhaps not nerves, Miss Marple mused, but calculation. Clarissa liked things tidy, especially her reputation. A cousin murdered on one's property was the very opposite of tidy. The inspector called for the first interview, choosing Colonel Weatherford, who straightened immediately and marched toward the constable like a soldier reporting for duty. His booming voice carried easily across the lawn. "Found the body, you say?" No, I was nowhere near the trellis. I was examining the roses near the north side. Lovely color this season." His recounting drifted into botanical digressions that made the inspector's mustache twitch with impatience. As more villagers took their turns, Miss Marple remained seated, content to let the excitement swirl around her. It was early yet, and the first flurry of statements was always the least reliable. People saw what they expected to see, that was human nature. But every now and then, someone said something small, almost invisible, that did not match the rest, and that was often where truth began. She caught the tail end of Mr. Dencham's statement. "No, I hadn't spoken to Harold since he returned. Not beyond a polite greeting. Old family matters, best left untouched. You understand, Inspector." But his fingers, Miss Marple noted, tapped rapidly against his side, a nervous habit of a man who feared that old family matters might soon be pried open. Then it was Lily Archer's turn. She moved like someone walking through deep water, slow and unsteady. The inspector softened his tone. He had a certain fondness for young, frightened women, but Lily barely seemed aware of him. I didn't see him fall," she stammered. "I only noticed something odd by the roses. I thought perhaps a gardener had left something there, but then," her breath caught. "Then I realized it was a shoe." Inspector Graves nodded sympathetically. "Before that moment, did you see Mr. Harold Pencaro anywhere nearby? Or anyone else behaving strangely?" "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. "No one at all. I didn't speak to him today. I hardly ever spoke to him." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly at that. An interesting contradiction. one repeated with such insistence that it suggested the opposite of the truth. When Lily stepped back into the crowd, Miss Marple rose slowly and approached her. "My dear," she said kindly, "you must try to breathe. You've had a dreadful shock." Lily attempted a smile, but her lips quivered. I wish I'd stayed inside. If only I hadn't gone to refill the scones." "Scones?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Oh, then you passed near the trellis more than once today." The girl blinked, startled by her own oversight. Yes, I suppose I must have." "But you didn't see Mr. Pancaro," Miss Marple said, voice light as lace. "Not once?" A hesitation, a tiny one, like a hairline crack. "No. Not once." Miss Marple patted her arm gently, though her thoughts were already arranging themselves into quiet patterns. Across the lawn, Inspector Graves called for Mr. Bexley next. He stepped forward with a show of composure, but his stride lacked its earlier confidence. Miss Marple watched closely. If there was one thing she understood deeply, it was this: when a crime cast its first shadow, people showed their truest selves: fear, guilt, indignation, relief. All one had to do was look. And someone here was looking far too carefully at everyone else. Mr. Lionel Bexley stood before Inspector Graves with the air of a man accustomed to addressing boardrooms rather than crime scenes, though the faint sheen on his brow betrayed something less practiced. His gaze flicked briefly toward Miss Marple as he began speaking, and she noticed that he watched her just a moment too long, curious, cautious, as though trying to decide whether she was a harmless old woman or something more troublesome. "I was on the far side of the lawn, Inspector," Bexley said, voice smooth and controlled. "Near the hydrangeas. I heard a cry, Miss Archer's, I believe, and naturally came to see what had happened. Until that moment, I had no idea Harold Pancaro was even present." Inspector Graves jotted a note. "You had no dealings with Mr. Pancaro?" "None whatsoever. I only met him last evening at Mrs. Pancaro's dinner." A brief greeting. Bexley's tone remained calm, but his fingers curled slightly against his palm. "We exchanged pleasantries. Nothing more." "Pleasantries?" the inspector repeated. "No argument? No disagreement?" "Certainly not." Miss Marple watched the man carefully. He was telling the truth in the way a person might while very carefully avoiding another truth. She had seen the type before: men who believed information was a commodity to be spent only when advantageous. When Bexley finished and stepped back, the villagers shifted restlessly, waiting for the next name to be called. But before the inspector could choose, a shrill voice cut through the murmuring. "Inspector Graves. Surely you're not going to ignore the fact that Harold was seen quarreling earlier today?" Every head turned as Mrs. Weatherford marched forward, cheeks flushed with self-importance. Her husband gave a mortified groan, but it was too late. She was already in full command of the moment. "I distinctly heard raised voices from the east garden path just before the tea began," she continued. "I did not see who was speaking, but it must have been Harold. His temper was quite notorious." "Did you recognize the second voice?" Graves asked. "I said I did not see them," she huffed, "but it had a rather youthful tone. Perhaps a gardener? Or a tradesman? Or," her gaze flickered toward Lily Archer. The girl stiffened visibly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not at Lily, but at Mrs. Weatherford, whose eagerness to involve the young woman was out of step with her usual preference for avoiding village scandal. People with guilty knowledge often tried to steer suspicion elsewhere quickly. Inspector Graves rubbed his chin. "Miss Archer," he called, "are you certain you didn't encounter Mr. Pancaro earlier? Even in passing?" Lily swallowed hard. "No, Inspector. I've already explained." Mrs. Weatherford sniffed skeptically, but Graves moved on, calling Mr. Densham next. The solicitor stepped forward, posture stiff, and Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in his voice that hadn't been present earlier. I have nothing useful to contribute, Densham said. I arrived promptly at 3, as invited. I did not see Harold Pancaro until the unfortunate discovery. But you knew him once, the inspector pressed. Perhaps better than most here did. A lifetime ago, Densham replied tightly. We were acquaintances in youth. That is all. Miss Marple doubted it was quite all. Mr. Densham's gaze avoided everyone entirely when he spoke of Harold Pancaro. His history with the man was a knot he feared someone might untangle. A rustle passed through the group as 2 constables lifted Harold's body onto a stretcher. The sight drew a collective breath from the crowd. Even in death, Harold seemed to carry mysteries with him. His suit was well tailored but frayed at the cuffs, his shoes fine leather yet scuffed. A life lived between appearances and reality. Inspector Graves oversaw the removal grimly. We'll continue these statements inside, he said. The weather is turning. Miss Marple glanced upward. The sky remained bright, the clouds delicate and unthreatening. But Graves was correct in another sense, the air had shifted. The warmth of the afternoon had dulled into something staler, thicker. A village under strain. As the party moved slowly toward the house, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer at the rose trellis. A few petals had been crushed beneath the constable's boots, and a faint smear of mud trailed toward a narrow gap between the hedges. A gap that would allow someone to slip in or out unnoticed. She crouched just slightly, enough to peer at the damp earth. A footprint, a partial one, marked the soil. Not the heavy tread of a man's dress shoe. Something smaller. Narrower. She heard footsteps behind her. Oh, Miss Marple, Lily Archer's voice whispered. I didn't mean to frighten you. You didn't, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, rising. Are you feeling steadier now? I'm trying, Lily murmured. I keep thinking about what Mrs. Weatherford said. I didn't quarrel with him. I didn't even talk to him today. Quite so, Miss Marple replied, her tone soft, inviting truth rather than demanding it. And yet, you seem very troubled. Lily's eyes darted toward the hedge gap, just for a fraction of a second. Miss Marple noticed. It's horrible, Lily whispered. Just horrible. I wish I hadn't seen anything at all. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on the girl's arm. Sometimes the smallest things we see are the most important. But they are also the most easily misunderstood. Lily's breath hitched, and she gave a tiny nod, one that might have been agreement, or fear, or both. Inside the house, Inspector Graves called out, Miss Marple? We'll need your statement as well. Coming, Inspector, she replied. She cast one last glance at the trellis, the crushed roses, the faint muddy print, the place where death had brushed past beauty without hesitation. Then she followed Lily back toward the house, already thinking quietly, steadily, about the small inconsistencies forming faint outlines around the truth. Someone had come into that garden with purpose. And someone had walked out again, believing they had left nothing behind. Miss Marple entered the drawing room with the same mild composure she had worn in the garden, though the atmosphere here felt noticeably heavier. The large bay window overlooked the lawn where villagers still murmured in uneasy clumps, but inside the walls of Hawthorne Lodge the tension had turned inward, coiling through every corner of the room. Inspector Graves sat at a small escritoire, his notebook open, his pen poised with a sense of self-importance that suggested he expected her to divulge something illuminating. Miss Marple sat opposite him, smoothing the fold of her skirt before folding her hands neatly. I assume you noticed something I didn't, Graves said without preamble, though he tried to disguise the request as a challenge. Oh, Inspector, Miss Marple replied gently, I'm sure you've noticed quite a lot. I only ever see what little old ladies tend to see. Graves harumphed, unconvinced. Very well. Tell me what you were doing at the time the body was discovered. She explained simply, her seat among the roses, her hearing Lily's cry, the collective movement toward the trellis. Nothing more. Graves asked about the footprint near the hedge gap, but Miss Marple tilted her head with polite confusion. Footprint? I'm afraid I wouldn't know anything about that. Graves frowned. He didn't like puzzles that slipped beyond his grasp. He preferred his mysteries to fit neatly into statements and timelines. But Miss Marple was already rising, thanking him for his time, and, irritatingly, he could find no reason to detain her further. She stepped into the hallway as Rupert Densham nearly collided with her. The solicitor muttered a tight apology and hurried onward, his face flushed and eyes too bright. The sound of his footsteps receded quickly, as though he found safety only in distance. Miss Marple watched him go, thoughtful. The drawing-room curtains fluttered faintly as she walked toward the conservatory at the back of the house. She didn't intend to pry, but she had always found that the more agitated a group became, the more revealing its quieter corners often were. Voices drifted from behind a tall vase of lilies, Lily Archer's soft tremor and Mrs. Pencaro's sharp, clipped tone. "You mustn't say anything foolish," Mrs. Pencaro whispered. "Do you understand? The inspector will twist words if he thinks it will make his job easier. And I won't have this household dragged through scandal." Lily's reply was barely audible. "I didn't say anything untrue." "I should hope not. Harold's affairs were messy enough already." Miss Marple paused just long enough to absorb the exchange, then coughed lightly as she stepped into view. Mrs. Pencaro straightened instantly, though her smile was brittle. "Miss Marple. Dear me, what a trying day. Poor Harold. Such an inconvenient tragedy." "Inconvenient, indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "I do hope Lily is managing. She seems quite shaken." Mrs. Pencaro offered a dismissive flutter of her hand. "Oh, Lily is overly sensitive. A sweet girl, but prone to nerves. She imagines things. Best not to trouble her further." But Lily was not looking imaginary at all. She stood taut as piano wire, her knuckles white where she gripped her apron. Miss Marple gave her a comforting smile before moving on. Outside the conservatory door stood Mr. Bexley. Whether he had been waiting to speak to her or simply found himself loitering with restless purpose, Miss Marple could not yet say. He approached with a polite bow of the head. "Awful situation," he murmured. "I can't imagine what could have prompted such violence in such a place." "Human nature has a way of appearing when least desired," Miss Marple said quietly. "Motives are often simpler than we think: fear, pride, resentment. Sometimes something as small as a disagreement over property." Bexley's eyes flickered. Barely a second, but enough to note. He swallowed. "Do you believe that's relevant here?" "Oh, I haven't said that," Miss Marple replied with a warm, vague smile. "Merely that one never knows what burdens a man carries, or what burdens others would rather he not reveal." Bexley's composure tightened. Well, I should join the others." He departed abruptly, leaving Miss Marple with the quiet certainty that he had far more to hide than he wished to admit. Inspector Graves emerged from the drawing-room shortly after, waving Miss Marple over with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "Mrs. Pencaro claims Harold had no enemies," he said. "Yet everyone I speak to seems to have some quarrel or suspicion lurking beneath. And the girl, Miss Archer, she's scared stiff." "That is often the way," Miss Marple replied. "People rarely speak their real concerns when they feel watched." Graves eyed her. "You think she knows something?" "I think she knows more than she knows," Miss Marple said mildly. "Young girls often do." Before Graves could respond, a sudden cry echoed from the entry hall, sharp, startled, unmistakably male. The inspector rushed forward, Miss Marple not far behind. Colonel Weatherford stood rigid beside the front table, where letters and small parcels for guests had been placed earlier. But now, scattered across the polished wood, lay a torn envelope bearing Harold Pencaro's name, opened, its contents removed. What happened here? Graves barked. Weatherford pointed shakily. That wasn't open before. Someone's taken whatever was inside. Miss Marple moved closer. The envelope was thick, its tear jagged, made in haste. But what held her attention was the faint indentation in the shape of folded paper still visible against the inner sleeve. Something important had been inside. And someone hadn't wanted the inspector to see it. As Graves rounded on the gathering crowd, demanding to know who had tampered with evidence, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the door leading down the back corridor. It was just closing. Quietly. Carefully. Without a sound. She knew, in that moment, that the investigation had shifted. Someone was no longer waiting to see what the inspector discovered. Someone was trying to stay one step ahead. And that someone was growing desperate. Inspector Graves lunged toward the corridor door, flinging it open with a force that caused it to rebound off the wall. The hallway beyond stretched long and dim, lined with ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to widen in accusation as the inspector stormed past. But by the time he reached the far end, the back entrance stood ajar, swaying slightly, the only sign that someone had slipped out just moments before. Miss Marple, following at a far gentler pace, paused at the threshold. She bent carefully, noticing a faint smear on the polished floorboards. Not mud this time. Graphite, perhaps. Or the residue of something chalky, crushed underfoot. A small detail, easy to overlook. The inspector, red-faced and breathless, marched back toward her. Gone, he barked. Whoever opened that envelope knew exactly what they were doing. One might almost think, Miss Marple murmured, that they feared what others might learn if its contents were found. Graves bristled. Are you implying one of the guests tampered with evidence right under my nose? Oh, not implying, Inspector. Only observing. People under strain do the most surprising things. She straightened. Perhaps we should consider who was nearest the table. That's half the village, he snapped, then composed himself. Still. Weatherford was the one who found it. And seemed rather startled, Miss Marple added softly. Though not entirely surprised. Graves opened his mouth to respond, but a flurry of footsteps announced Mrs. Bantry, who bustled toward them with a mixture of indignation and excitement. Inspector. You simply must come at once. Clarissa is in quite a state. She insists something else has gone missing, something from her late cousin's room. Graves groaned. What now? I haven't the faintest idea, but she's making such a fuss that the servants can hardly hear themselves dust. The inspector strode off, Mrs. Bantry scurrying behind him like a determined hen. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, thinking as she walked. Harold Pencaro's room was on the second floor, overlooking the east garden path. An interesting vantage point, she reflected, for a man newly returned to a village full of people who would rather not revisit the past with him. Mrs. Pencaro was waiting at the door to the guest room, her expression torn between offended propriety and genuine anxiety. Inspector. Thank goodness. Someone's been in here. Harold's suitcase, look at it. The suitcase lay open on the bedspread. Clothes had been sifted through, not thrown about in the careless fashion of thieves but examined. Someone searching for something specific. Graves frowned. What exactly is missing? A small diary, Mrs. Pencaro said promptly. He carried it everywhere. Leather-bound. He told me once it contained his personal recollections of his travels. Miss Marple detected the half-second pause before the word personal. Mrs. Pencaro knew more than she wanted to say. And you're certain it was here earlier? The inspector asked. I saw it myself this morning when I checked the room, she insisted. Harold kept it in the suitcase, tucked into the side pocket. A diary, Graves repeated. And someone went to great lengths to get it. Or to destroy it, Miss Marple thought privately. She moved closer to the suitcase, her fingertips brushing the frayed edges of a shirt collar. Harold had been a man who lived carelessly. Yet even careless men held on to something: letters, debts, secrets. Diaries were rarely written for nostalgia alone. Miss Marple glanced toward the writing desk. A faint square of dust indicated where something had rested before being removed. Not the diary, it was too small, but perhaps a stack of papers. A letter. Or invoices. Proof of something. Mrs. Pencaro saw the direction of her gaze. "Oh yes," she said airily. "There were some papers there. I took them earlier to give to Inspector Graves." Graves looked surprised. "You didn't mention that." "Well, I didn't think they were relevant. They were merely Harold's business notes." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Most murders, Mrs. Pencaro, tend to revolve around business of one sort or another." Mrs. Pencaro flinched, her composure momentarily cracking. Before anyone could probe further, footsteps sounded from the landing. Lily Archer appeared, clutching the banister, breathless and pale. "Mrs. Pencaro," she gasped, "you need to come downstairs. It's Mr. Bexley, he's asking to speak with you urgently. He says it's important." Mrs. Pencaro blanched. Now? Of all times? What could he possibly want? Lily swallowed, her voice trembling. "He said, it concerns Harold." The inspector immediately strode toward the stairs, but Miss Marple caught Lily gently by the sleeve. "My dear," she said quietly, "you look quite distressed." Lily shook her head, but the motion was jerky, unconvincing. "I'm just tired, Miss Marple." Tiredness doesn't usually cause one to tremble so. A long moment passed. Lily's eyes shimmered with something heavier than fear, burden, guilt, longing to confess yet terrified to do so. Then she whispered, almost inaudibly, "I think Mr. Bexley knows something he shouldn't." Miss Marple's heart pricked with quiet urgency. "And how would he know such a thing, Lily?" But Lily backed away, shaking her head, retreating down the corridor. "I shouldn't have said anything. Please, forget it, Miss Marple." "Forget it? Impossible." Miss Marple tucked the remark away with the others, letting it settle into place among the patterns forming in her mind. By the time she descended to the drawing room, Mr. Bexley stood in the center as though delivering a declaration. His face was taut, his confidence drained like water from a cracked vase. "Mrs. Pencaro," he said as she approached, "I must speak with you privately. Something has come to my attention. Something, about Harold." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of us." Bexley hesitated, just a heartbeat too long. Then he nodded. "Very well," he said, voice steadying. "Harold came to see me last night. And he wasn't here for pleasantries. He wanted money. A substantial sum. He said he had information that could ruin someone in this village." A chill rippled through the room. Even Graves looked temporarily stunned. "And what did you tell him?" the inspector demanded. "I refused, of course. I told him I didn't know anything about his supposed information." Miss Marple watched the man closely. He was telling the truth, part of it, at least. His fear was too controlled to be wholly fabricated. Harold implied, Bexley continued, that others might be willing to pay. That he had options. Mrs. Pencaro gasped softly. Miss Marple exhaled very quietly. A man blackmailing half a village never lacked enemies. And one of those enemies, standing in this very room, had decided Harold Pencaro would not survive to collect his price. Inspector Graves stared at Bexley as if weighing the truth in every tremor of the man's hands. But before he could press with further questions, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck the quarter hour, its chime thin, eerie, and altogether ill-timed. It seemed to fracture what little composure remained in the room. Mrs. Pencaro lowered herself into a chair, her fingers clutching the armrests with such force the veins stood out along her wrists. Miss Marple watched her closely. Few people reacted so dramatically unless something in Bexley's account cut close to a wound they had hoped would remain hidden. "Blackmail, then," Graves muttered. "Just what we needed." "It could also be a bluff," Bexley countered quickly, almost too quickly. Harold was a wanderer. The stories he told, half of them were surely nonsense. And yet, Miss Marple said pleasantly, nonsense can still frighten people when it resembles the truth too closely. Bexley flinched. Graves turned toward him again, clearly sensing blood in the water. "Did he say who he meant to approach if you refused?" "No," Bexley said. "He only said he had choices. That someone else might be more appreciative." Miss Marple noticed his hesitation on the final words, not a stumble, but a careful adjustment, as though masking the exact phrasing Harold had used. She was about to ask what that phrasing might have been when they heard a sharp clatter from the hallway. Graves swore under his breath. Lily Archer appeared once more, her cheeks blotched with color. "Inspector," she whispered, "there's someone outside. Near the hedge by the east lawn. I saw a figure." They were crouched down as if, looking for something. Graves shot Miss Marple a wary glance before marching out of the drawing room. Miss Marple followed, though at her own measured pace. If someone had been lurking, they would have expected the inspector's arrival. Panic made footsteps louder, breath heavier, the small involuntary sounds betraying their presence long before the eyes detected movement. The east lawn was quiet, the grass slick from the earlier mist. The hedge curved in a long arc, its center denser where the branches pressed close together. Graves approached it boldly, parting the leaves with a brusque shove. "Show yourself," he shouted. But only silence answered. Miss Marple drifted closer. Her gaze lowered to the soil beneath the hedge. It was disturbed, not heavily, but enough to suggest someone had knelt there. And something else caught the faint glimmer of afternoon light, a thin sliver of metal lodged in the dirt. She bent, plucked it free, and brushed it clean. A broken cufflink. Not new. Polished but well worn. And unmistakably distinctive. Graves turned just as she held it up. "What's that?" "Something someone dropped while in a rather inconvenient position," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps when they heard Lily coming." He took it from her and narrowed his eyes. "I've seen this pattern before." "So have I," Miss Marple said gently. "At breakfast, on Mr. Weatherford's sleeve." Graves swore again, louder this time. "Weatherford. Of course he's mixed up in this." "We should be cautious, Inspector," Miss Marple replied in her mild voice. "A lost cufflink only tells us someone was here. Not what they sought, or whether they were the one responsible for Harold's unfortunate end." Graves opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, the sound of hurried footsteps drew their attention. Mr. Weatherford himself appeared, breathless, his eyes darting between the inspector and Miss Marple. I heard shouting," he stammered. "Is something wrong?" Graves practically pounced. "Something wrong? You tell me. Lose anything today, Weatherford?" Weatherford blinked rapidly, confusion, or a very good imitation of it, clouding his features. "I don't understand." Graves held up the cufflink. Weatherford's face drained of color. Miss Marple watched him closely. Shock, yes, but not entirely about being caught. There was something else, a flicker of despair, almost resignation. As if he had been expecting this moment, yet hoping desperately it wouldn't come. I don't know how that got there," he said weakly. "Don't you?" Graves barked. "Then what were you doing near the hedge?" "I wasn't. I've been in the library for the last half hour." "And can anyone confirm that?" Weatherford swallowed. "Lily brought me tea. She would have seen me." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Lily again. The poor girl was more entangled in this matter than she dared admit. Whether willingly or not remained to be seen. Graves jerked his head toward the house. "We'll ask her ourselves." They returned indoors, but Lily was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Bantry, bustling through the hallway with an air of theatrical concern, informed them that Lily had gone upstairs moments earlier, looking pale and upset. Miss Marple excused herself from the inspector's brisk march and took the staircase with quiet purpose. Lily's door was slightly ajar. She knocked gently, then entered. Lily sat on the edge of her bed, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. When she saw Miss Marple, her eyes overflowed. "I didn't mean for any of this," she whispered. Miss Marple sat beside her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "My dear, I know. But if you keep carrying this alone, it will only grow heavier." Lily shook her head. "He said I mustn't tell. He said it was safer for me if I stayed quiet." "And who told you that?" Lily hesitated, her breath catching, her lips parting as though war waged between loyalty and fear. Finally, she whispered one name. "Mr. Weatherford." Miss Marple's eyes gentled, though her mind quickened at once. "And what was he trying to protect you from, Lily?" The girl trembled, gripping the handkerchief so tightly her knuckles whitened. "From Harold," she whispered. "He knew something about me. Something he wanted to use. And Mr. Weatherford was trying to keep him away." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand over Lily's. "My dear child," she said softly, "you've just told me the first truth that fits perfectly." And downstairs, entirely unaware, Inspector Graves was preparing to accuse a man who may have been guilty, yet not in the way he imagined. Miss Marple remained with Lily only long enough to reassure her, smoothing the girl's hair in the way a fond aunt might. It was quite extraordinary, she reflected, how even the most frightened young woman could steady herself when spoken to gently. Lily's trembling subsided, her tears drying into faint, silvery traces on her cheeks. But her confession had raised a most important question, one Miss Marple intended to consider with care as she made her way downstairs again. She found Inspector Graves in the drawing room, Weatherford planted stiffly in an armchair opposite him, shoulders hunched like a schoolboy awaiting punishment. Mrs. Bantry hovered anxiously near the mantelpiece, wringing a lace handkerchief between her fingers. Miss Marple slipped quietly into the room, drawing little attention save for a fleeting glance from Weatherford, whose desperation deepened the moment he saw her. Graves continued questioning him with blunt persistence, about the cufflink, about the hedge, about any possible motive for harming Harold Fenn. Weatherford denied everything, though his voice shook, undermining the strength of his claims. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting not just what he said but how he held himself, how he avoided certain phrases or hesitated before others. It wasn't guilt she saw, but conflict, as though he were protecting something fragile, something he feared might shatter under Graves' hammering inquiries. At last, Graves threw up his hands. "You're as evasive as a fox trapped in a henhouse," he declared. "And the evidence is mounting." "I didn't kill Harold," Weatherford insisted, his voice raw. "But I couldn't let him hurt Lily." Mrs. Bantry let out a small cry of shock. Graves stiffened. Miss Marple, however, only inclined her head slightly. "And what precisely did you fear he might do, Mr. Weatherford?" she asked gently. Weatherford sank back, defeated. He knew something about her. Something from before she came here. He said he'd tell everyone if she didn't help him. Graves seized on the word. Help him? Help him with what? But Weatherford shook his head. "I don't know. I only know he frightened her terribly." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Lily mentioned that he'd threatened her. But she didn't say with what." Weatherford's hands clenched. "It isn't my place to reveal it." Graves scoffed. "Not your place? A man has been murdered, Weatherford, and your insistence on propriety isn't doing you any favors." Before Weatherford could answer, the drawing-room doors burst open and Lily herself rushed in, breathless from running. She stopped short, seeing them all gathered, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of determination and fear. "Please," she pleaded, "don't blame Mr. Weatherford. He only tried to help me. I should be the one to explain." Miss Marple stepped toward her. "Only if you feel ready, dear." Lily nodded earnestly and clasped her hands tightly. "Before I came to St. Bede's, I worked for a family in Surrey. They dismissed me. There were accusations." She swallowed hard. "A brooch went missing. A valuable one. They said I took it." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Oh, my word." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Oh, my word." "But I didn't," Lily insisted. "I swear I didn't. Only, no one believed me. I left in disgrace, and it followed me here. Harold, he must have known somehow. He said he'd spread it through the whole village unless I helped him distract Mr. Weatherford during the party." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Distract him? At what precise time?" "Just after dessert," Lily whispered. "We were all outdoors then. Harold said it would only take a few minutes, and I was frightened. I didn't know what he meant to do." Graves leaned forward. "And did you distract Weatherford?" She nodded miserably. "Only for a moment. On the terrace. I asked him to help me find Mrs. Bantry's embroidery scissors. I felt horrible about it, but he came along with me." Miss Marple was thinking very quickly indeed. Dessert had been served at 3:30. Harold had disappeared not long after. That meant Lily had unwittingly given someone a window of opportunity, someone who needed Weatherford out of the way. But who? A sudden commotion erupted in the hall. Bexley appeared in the doorway, breathless, pale, and visibly shaken. "Inspector Graves," he gasped, "you must come immediately. There's been another incident." Graves sprang up. "What now?" "It's the study," Bexley stammered. "Mr. Pencaro," he collapsed. "I think, oh, dear God, I think someone tried to poison him." Mrs. Bantry screamed. Lily clutched her mouth. Weatherford shot up from his chair, white as a sheet. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly still, her eyes narrowing with sudden intuition, a startling clarity piecing together the scattered fragments like a quilt arranged by a practiced hand. "Poison," she murmured, almost to herself. How very desperate. Graves had already rushed toward the door. Miss Marple followed, the soft but urgent tap of her footsteps barely rising above the chaos. If someone had attempted a second crime, then the murderer, feeling pressure closing in, was growing reckless. And reckless people, Miss Marple knew from long experience, were far easier to catch. They reached the study. The scene within was grim. Mr. Pencaro slumped over his desk, a glass overturned beside him, dark liquid dripping onto the carpet. His breaths were shallow but present, faint wheezes that suggested a struggle rather than a fatal blow. "He's alive," Graves said with relief. "Get the doctor. Now." Bexley sprinted off, nearly stumbling in the doorway. Miss Marple approached the desk. The smell rising from the spilt drink was sharp, unmistakably tainted. But what struck her most was not the poisoned glass, but a second, identical one resting on a tray nearby, untouched. 2 glasses. One poisoned. One safe. And only one person who would have known which was which. Her eyes drifted toward the doorway, to the figure who hovered there quietly, unnoticed in the frenzy. Mrs. Pencaro. Her face was bone white, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held a wild, shuddered fear. Miss Marple's lips formed a thin, thoughtful line. The killer's mask, she knew, had just begun to crack. The doctor arrived within minutes, a brisk, capable man who smelled faintly of antiseptic. He pushed past the cluster of anxious onlookers and knelt beside Mr. Pencaro, examining him with quiet efficiency. Miss Marple stepped aside to give him room, folding her hands neatly before her as she observed the scene. "He'll live," the doctor announced after a tense moment. "It appears to have been a mild dose, enough to cause collapse, but not fatal unless he'd taken much more." Graves exhaled sharply. Mild dose or not, someone tried to silence him. Weatherford stood near the window, his face still drained of color. Lily hovered near the door, clearly torn between fear and the desire to be helpful. Mrs. Pencarrow had moved not an inch since they entered the room. She remained fixed by the doorway, her knuckles white against the wood, her entire frame rigid as though she feared the slightest movement might betray her. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her only a moment before shifting back to the desk. 2 glasses. A small detail, easily missed in the rush. But she had seen something else, too, a faint ring of moisture marking where another glass had once rested. 3 glasses had been here originally. Someone had removed one. Miss Marple began to suspect the poisoning had not been intended for Mr. Pencarrow at all. While the doctor instructed Bexley to prepare a bed for Mr. Pencarrow upstairs, Graves paced the study like a man cornered by invisible foes. This is escalating. First Fenn, now Pencarrow. Someone's panicking. Or someone is redirecting suspicion, Miss Marple murmured. Graves stopped mid-step. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning only that a poisoned glass placed so openly is almost a little too convenient. In my experience, Inspector, murderers who act from panic hide their acts. Murderers who act from calculation display them. Graves stared, baffled but listening. So you think this was staged? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that the intended victim may not have been Mr. Pencarrow at all. A ripple ran through the room. Weatherford straightened, puzzled. Lily gasped softly. Mrs. Bantry clutched her pearls with an audible click. Graves rubbed his temples. Then who, Miss Marple? Who would someone here want dead badly enough to poison them, yet carelessly enough to fail? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed to the desk, her eyes scanning the scattered papers. Among them lay a crumpled note, half hidden beneath a ledger. She touched the edge lightly. "May I?" she asked. Graves nodded. The paper was torn at the top, written in hurried, almost agitated script. "We must talk. Tonight. There is something you should know before the inspector hears it from someone else. Come alone." It was signed with a single initial, H. Harold. Miss Marple read it twice, once for its words, and once for the silences between them. Carefully, she replaced it exactly where it had been. "This note suggests Mr. Pencarrow had reason to fear what Harold might reveal," she said quietly. Weatherford let out a slow breath. Then Pencarrow had motive. Possibly, Miss Marple allowed. But the matter is rarely so straightforward. Motive may be shared among many, yet the hand that acts is seldom the one first suspected. Graves scratched at his jaw. Meaning there's someone else with even more to lose. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Pencarrow. "My dear," she said in her kindest tone, "would you be good enough to tell us whether your husband met Harold yesterday?" Mrs. Pencarrow's lips parted, her breath catching. Her eyes flickered to her husband, still unconscious, and then to the others, as if searching for a safe harbor. "Yes," she whispered at last. They spoke briefly. "In the rose arbor. I saw them from the breakfast room window." "And did Mr. Pencarrow appear upset afterward?" Another hesitation. Another flicker of fear. He seemed shaken. "He went to his study for nearly an hour. When I asked what Harold wanted, he only said it was nothing, that he would handle it." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you. That must have been difficult." Graves seized upon the admission. So Pencarrow was being blackmailed too. Weatherford looked stunned. Then Harold was threatening half the village. Miss Marple made a small, thoughtful sound. Blackmail tends to grow like ivy, winding its tendrils around anyone who shows the slightest vulnerability. Harold Fenn had discovered something dangerous. Something involving more than one person. Perhaps he hoped to choose the most profitable target. Graves folded his arms. And now someone's trying to eliminate anyone who knew what he'd found. Or, Miss Marple said softly, someone is trying to conceal their own involvement while letting others take the blame. The doctor and Bexley struggled to lift Mr. Pencaro onto a stretcher. Mrs. Pencaro moved instantly to her husband's side, but not with the frantic urgency one might expect. Instead, she hovered with a strange restraint, as though fearful of being too close, or of touching him at the wrong moment. Miss Marple watched her closely. "Inspector," the doctor called, "I'll need to monitor him for a few hours, but he should recover. Only rest and quiet for now." The procession departed upstairs, leaving the study quieter, the atmosphere shifting from frantic alarm to a tense, simmering uncertainty. Graves resumed pacing. "We're dealing with a killer who's still here. In this house." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And who has grown bold?" Weatherford stood at the window, staring out across the lawn. If Mr. Pencaro wasn't the intended victim, who was? Miss Marple joined him, peering out at the darkening grounds. The sky was streaked with violet and rose, a deceptively peaceful backdrop for a house now steeped in fear. "The intended victim," she said softly, "was someone who threatened to expose the murderer. Someone dangerous not because of violence, but because of truth." She turned, not toward Graves, not toward Weatherford or Lily, but toward the empty doorway where Mrs. Pencaro had stood moments earlier. "And I fear," she added quietly, "that her silence has already told us more than she wished." For the first time since arriving at Pencaro House, Miss Marple felt the unmistakable chill that came not from the air but from standing in the shadow of a desperate criminal. And desperate criminals, she knew well, were capable of far more than poison. They were capable of one final, reckless act. Miss Marple left the study with the quiet conviction of someone who had just seen a vital piece of a puzzle slip perfectly into place. The others, however, were adrift in speculation. Inspector Graves muttered darkly under his breath as he strode toward the corridor. Weatherford trailed behind him wearing an expression of conflicted confusion, and Lily hovered anxiously, unsure whether to remain or follow. "You'd best get some air, Lily," Miss Marple advised gently. "A brisk walk on the terrace might steady your nerves." Lily nodded gratefully and slipped away. Miss Marple turned to Weatherford next, addressing him with unusual directness. "Mr. Weatherford, I believe you have been protecting more than Lily's reputation. There is something you have not yet said, and I must ask you not to withhold it any longer." Weatherford stared at her, startled. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," Miss Marple murmured. "Your loyalty is admirable, but it becomes dangerous when it obscures the truth. And truth, Mr. Weatherford, is very much needed now." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Guilt, but the guilt of omission, not crime, flickered unmistakably across his face. Before Miss Marple could press him further, footsteps sounded from the upper landing, followed by Mrs. Pencaro's strained voice. "Inspector Graves? A moment, please." Graves turned sharply on his heel. "What is it now?" Mrs. Pencaro descended the stairs with a brittle dignity, the kind of posture one maintained only when everything within them was splintering. When she reached the bottom, she paused, her eyes drifting toward Miss Marple before shifting back to Graves. "I have something to say," she announced in a controlled, trembling voice. "It concerns my husband." Weatherford inhaled sharply, and Miss Marple glanced at him, noting his reaction with quiet interest. Graves folded his arms. "We're listening." Mrs. Pencaro wrung her hands together. "My husband, he met Harold more than once. In fact, Harold came to the house 2 nights ago. They spoke in the study for nearly an hour. I asked what Harold wanted, but my husband refused to tell me. Later that night, I heard him pacing in the hall, muttering. He said Harold was threatening to expose something he'd done in his past. Graves narrowed his eyes. What sort of thing? I don't know, Mrs. Pencarrow whispered, her voice cracking on the words. But he said it would ruin everything. Miss Marple observed her carefully. The fear was real, but something else hid beneath it. Not quite deception, and not quite guilt. More like surrender. As though she feared a truth not yet spoken. Mrs. Pencarrow, Miss Marple said gently, was your husband concerned for himself, or for you? A tremor coursed through the woman's frame. Her eyes widened, filling with sudden, raw panic. I don't understand, she stammered. But she did. Miss Marple could see it in the way her fingers clenched her skirt, in the way her gaze flicked toward the staircase, where her husband lay recovering. Graves stepped closer. Madam, if you know something, now is the time to say it. Mrs. Pencarrow backed away a step, her composure cracking. I have told you everything. Not quite, Miss Marple said softly. Before she could speak further, Bexley hurried into the hall, breathless from running. Inspector. I've found something, in Mr. Pencarrow's desk. They followed him back into the study. Bexley pointed toward the open drawer. Inside lay a small envelope, sealed but easily opened. Graves tore it open and withdrew a stack of old letters, not many, but enough. He unfolded the top one. His brows shot up. Good Lord. Weatherford moved closer. What is it? Letters from Harold Fenn, Graves said grimly. Threats. Demands. He wanted money, large amounts. And here, look at this. He held up one letter. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward without touching it. You know what I can reveal. You know who will be ruined if I speak. Pay what you owe, and I'll keep her secrets safe. Graves looked triumphant. This confirms it. Pencarrow was being blackmailed for his wife's sake. Mrs. Pencarrow gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He hid it from me, she whispered. He told me it was nothing. Miss Marple studied her. The shock was genuine, yes, but something didn't sit quite right. Mrs. Pencarrow was trembling not with the fear of being exposed, but with something resembling remorse. Weatherford stepped closer to her. Mrs. Pencarrow, what secret was Harold threatening to reveal? She shook her head violently. I don't know, I swear I don't know. Harold must have misled him. Miss Marple watched her with a sharp, discerning eye. Lies often revealed themselves not in the words spoken but in the ones avoided. Before Graves could push further, Lily reappeared at the doorway, panting. Inspector. You must come at once. What now? He barked. It's Mr. Pencarrow, Lily gasped. He's awake. And he's asking for Miss Marple. The room fell silent. Miss Marple dipped her head, as though acknowledging an invitation she expected all along. I shall go to him, she said. She ascended the stairs with her characteristic quiet grace, but inwardly her mind raced. A man awakening from poisoning, one who had been blackmailed, one who had concealed letters, one whose wife was unraveling before their eyes, might finally reveal the missing piece. In the dim guest bedroom, Mr. Pencarrow lay propped against pillows, his face pale but alert. His eyes lifted as Miss Marple entered. You wanted to see me, she said gently. He nodded weakly. Yes. I did. There's something I must tell you. Miss Marple moved closer, sitting beside him. What is it? Mr. Pencarrow swallowed, his voice rasping. The glass, it wasn't meant for me. She did not feign surprise. No. It wasn't. His eyes widened, startled that she already knew. Then, you understand, he whispered. It was meant for, he broke off suddenly, his breath hitching. From the doorway, someone shifted. Miss Marple turned her head slightly, not enough to alarm, but enough to see. Mrs. Poirot stood there. Frozen. White as chalk. And for the first time since the murder began unraveling the household piece by piece, Miss Marple saw it, the unmistakable terror of a woman who realized the truth she had tried desperately to bury was about to be spoken aloud. A truth that might destroy one of them, or both. Miss Marple gently placed her hand on Mr. Poirot's arm. "Rest," she murmured. "You've done enough for now." But her eyes never left Mrs. Poirot. Because the final act of their dangerous play was now very near. And Miss Marple knew the next move belonged to the killer. The faint lamplight in the guest bedroom flickered, softening the harsh lines of fatigue etched into Mr. Poirot's face. Miss Marple waited until his breathing settled again before rising quietly to her feet. Mrs. Poirot remained in the doorway, her fingers gripping the frame as if the wood alone kept her anchored to the moment. "Mrs. Poirot," Miss Marple said gently, smoothing her skirt with deliberate calm, "would you be so kind as to join us downstairs? I believe we may achieve some clarity if everyone concerned is present." Mrs. Poirot's lips parted, soundless at first, then forming a fragile response. If you think it necessary." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite." In the drawing-room, Inspector Graves, Weatherford, Lily, and Mrs. Bantry gathered anxiously. The air felt close, as though the walls were leaning inward, listening. Miss Marple motioned for Mrs. Poirot to sit, then positioned herself with modest authority near the hearth. Inspector Graves wasted no time. "Miss Marple, if Poirot knows who the poisoned glass was meant for, we need it stated plainly." "And so it shall be," she replied. "But first, it would be wise to consider the true nature of each clue we've encountered. For instance, the poisoned glass. A curious choice. Poisons, you see, require planning but also proximity. One does not poison at random. One chooses." She turned her eyes to Mrs. Poirot, whose breath hitched. "3 glasses were present," Miss Marple continued. "One has gone missing. The poisoned one was left conspicuously near Mr. Poirot. But the intended target was not Mr. Poirot himself." Graves leaned forward. "Then who?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "The person Harold Fenn most feared. The only person whose secret could have truly ruined him, and who knew it." Weatherford blinked. "Harold feared someone?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said. "He feared her enough to make a final demand of Mr. Poirot, a higher sum, for greater risk. It is obvious in the phrasing of his letters." She took a measured breath. Harold had stumbled onto a secret about Mrs. Poirot's past. Not a stolen brooch, nor a petty scandal, but a much older, far more damaging truth. Mrs. Poirot's fingers twitched violently in her lap. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "she is not precisely who she claims to be." A stunned silence fell. In her youth, Mrs. Poirot lived under another name, a name Harold recognized when his rambling travels took him through a small town in the north. She had been involved in a tragic accident. A man died. Some believed it murder. But she fled before an inquiry could conclude. Harold discovered the truth, and that truth, buried for decades, was her greatest terror. Mrs. Poirot's breath came shallowly, but she said nothing. Harold, delighted by such a profitable opportunity, tried blackmail. But Mrs. Poirot is not a woman easily cornered. She convinced her husband to negotiate, though she did not tell him why the threat terrified her so deeply. And yesterday, when Harold pressed more aggressively, she realized he meant to reveal everything, whether she paid or not. Graves stepped forward. So she killed him. Miss Marple's tone remained almost tender. Yes. Though she had not intended murder. She only meant to confront him, to persuade him to stop. But Harold, brash and emboldened, threatened to shout her secret aloud right there in front of the garden party guests. There was a struggle. He fell, and there was that unfortunate broken marble bench nearby. It was, in essence, an accident, but one that benefited her too much to confess. Mrs. Pencarrow bowed her head, trembling. As for the poison, Miss Marple continued, she meant it for the person who might yet expose her, the one who noticed more than he should. Her husband. She paused, letting the room absorb the shock. For he had begun to suspect the truth she never fully explained. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Lily began to cry softly. Mrs. Pencarrow raised her head then, her eyes hollow. I didn't want to, she whispered. But he asked questions, too many. I thought he'd discover what happened years ago. And if he told the authorities, after all this time, the shame would destroy us both. But the glass was switched, Miss Marple said kindly. Quite unknowingly, when your husband moved his papers. He reached for the wrong one. Fortune, in a rare charitable mood, spared him. Graves stepped forward, his jaw taut. Mrs. Pencarrow, you understand you'll have to come with me. Mrs. Pencarrow's face crumpled, but she no longer resisted. Her composure collapsed into a kind of exhausted resignation. Yes, she whispered. It was always going to come to this. Weatherford put a gentle arm around Lily, who sobbed harder. Mrs. Bantry dabbed her face with a lace handkerchief, distraught. Graves called for Bexley, and together they escorted Mrs. Pencarrow from the room. Her steps were soft, almost relieved, as though the weight she had carried was finally too heavy to hold. When quiet returned to the drawing-room, Miss Marple sank gracefully into a chair. Weatherford approached her, bewildered. How did you know? He asked. Oh, Miss Marple said with a faint smile, in my village, I once knew a woman who hid a great scandal for years. It made her watchful. Too watchful. Mrs. Pencarrow had that same look about her, that of a person waiting for a shadow to catch up. And Harold, poor foolish man, enjoyed digging in shadows he didn't understand. Weatherford nodded slowly, the truth settling around him like dust. And the others? He asked quietly. Mr. Pencarrow. Lily, both innocent, Miss Marple said. Their secrets were small things. Human things. But Mrs. Pencarrow's was of a different nature, something she had lived in fear of for a very long time. In the hallway outside, Graves called for the constable. Doors opened and shut. Footsteps echoed. And then, the house settled into a long exhale. Weatherford escorted Lily to the kitchen for tea. Mrs. Bantry retired to her room for a restorative lie-down. And Miss Marple remained alone by the hearth, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Pencarrow had not been cruel. Merely frightened. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, shaped more crimes than anger ever could. She rose quietly when the hour grew late, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. As she prepared to leave, Graves stopped her at the door. You know, he said, every time I think I've got the measure of human nature, you prove I've barely scratched the surface. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, Inspector, human nature is a vast thing. But people, at heart, behave just as they always have. One learns to recognize the patterns. And with that, she stepped into the cool evening air, where the first stars trembled above Pencarrow House. The tragedy within would echo through the village for weeks. But life, as it always did, would settle again into its familiar rhythm. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever gentle, walked home with the quiet satisfaction that justice, in its own imperfect way, had been served.